is Harita Balakrishnan, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I welcome you to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled Golden Promises, Strategic Strengths, CPEC in the Long Shadow of Xi's Development Vision. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, has been one of the most prominent components of China's Belt and Road Initiative, often presented as a transformative project for Pakistan economic development. With large-scale investments directed towards infrastructure, energy, and industrial growth, it has been framed as a pathway to regional connectivity and economic upliftment. However, more than a decade into its implementation, the outcomes have been uneven. While certain sectors, particularly energy, have seen some gains, several structural challenges continue to persist. These include delays in the development of special economic zones, rising financial pressures, governance concerns, and ongoing security challenges, particularly in regions where CPEC projects are concentrated. In this context, today's talk will explore how CPEC has unfolded in practice, analyzing both its achievements and its limitations. It will also reflect on the broader strategic implications, including how initiatives such as the Global Development Initiative intersect with CPEC and what this reveals about China's evolving development and foreign policy approach. Our speaker for today's seminar is Professor Sriparna Pathak, Professor of China Studies and Founding Director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University. Her work engages closely with Chinese foreign policy and international relations, and she is also associated with several research initiatives, including Taiwan's Double Think Lab. She has contributed extensively to academic and policy discussions on China, and her recent co-edited volume examines the strategic evolution of the Quad. The session today will be chaired by Ambassador T.C. Rangachari, a former career diplomat who has represented India in key international postings, including as ambassador to Algeria, Germany, and France. Over the course of his career, he has also worked in China, Pakistan, and at the United Nations, and has contributed significantly to India's diplomatic and policy landscape. He continues to remain actively engaged with academic and policy institutions. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Ambassador.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. Thank you, Harita. And good afternoon, Alkaji. Good afternoon, Professor Monti. All other participants who have joined. Very topical to talk about the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is now 13 years old. And from the estimates that I see, the Chinese have put in something like $1.4 trillion into this. And there are pluses, there are minuses. I have some things I would like to say, but I would first wait to hear what Professor Pathak has to say, because I'm sure all of you are waiting to hear her rather than me. The one thing that I do request everybody is to take note that the Chinese have now simplified in English language OBOR into BRI. But there is no Chinese equivalent of that. And in Chinese, it continues to remain OBOR. So I prefer to use the term OBOR to stay faithful to the Chinese terminology. And since the BRI was coined to kind of prettify it and make it seem less objectionable or threatening, that is something which we should leave to the Chinese side to do. One aspect of this is on the negative side is the difficulties that many countries who've been recipients of the assistance under this program that they feel. I'm sure Professor Pathak will address that in greater detail. What it has done on the positive side is that it has made the developed world much more conscious that they should be doing or giving assistance in much larger scale to the developing world. There are figures, again, I'm sure Professor Pathak will address that. And there are also comparisons in regard to the terms of what the developed world does and what the Chinese side does in terms of the terms and conditions, efficacy, willingness, and happiness to receive from one source and another. And then the culmination in terms of fruits of that in terms of development, growth, prosperity, expansion of trade, and so on. So that is the kind of framework that the One Belt, One Road initiative entails, which I am sure Professor Pathak will address in further detail. So let me wait till the question answer session and see what excites our audience, what interests our audience in terms of the future of this initiative of Xi Jinping. Thank you very much, Alkaji. Thank you very much, ICS, for having me on this occasion. And let me now invite Professor Pathak to make her presentation. Is there any time limit that we follow in these things, or it's open-ended?
No, of course, we normally expect our speakers to go on for about 35-40 minutes.
Okay.
And
Fair
then
enough. Yeah. Because I don't like to interrupt a speaker. So, if the Professor Pathak wants to take more time, I hope that's okay, because I think the subject should be of much interest in India, and I'm sure it is of interest.
No, that's fine. I mean, as I said, half an hour, 40 minutes, up to 45 minutes, it's up to...
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Pathak.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rangachari, and thank you, ICS, and special thank to Alka ma'am, who has been a trailblazer in the field of China studies in India. So I'm going to quickly jump into my topic, which is basically on China's CPEC and SEZs in Pakistan, and the strategic reality behind the Global Development Initiative. In 2021, in September 2021, at the United Nations General Assembly, China's President Xi Jinping announced the Global Development Initiative, or the GDI, a grand multilateral effort to accelerate the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It promised greener, healthier development focused on poverty alleviation, food security, climate action, digital economy, connectivity, and innovation. Now, Pakistan was amongst the earliest and the most enthusiastic supporters. But more than a decade into the $68 billion worth of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or the CPEC, which is a flagship project of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, the ground reality tells a completely different story. To unpack what has happened so far, what I'm going to do is basically run through the special economic zones promised under CPEC 1.0 and then move into CPEC 2.0. I'll also briefly touch upon some of the energy projects, the infrastructure, and just try to analyze how much of these have delivered tangible benefits or not for ordinary Pakistanis, and whether or not there is some sort of strategic leverage for Beijing in multilateral forums and bilateral relations because of a very willing Pakistan. Um, to begin with, the GDI and Pakistan's alignment, this initiative was framed as a revitalization of global development partnerships. Over 100 countries and organizations all expressed support, and a group of friends, quote unquote, group of friends, was formed. Priorities include poverty reduction, food security, and some of the things which I mentioned when I was beginning the presentation. Pakistan endorsed it, consistent with its long standing pattern of backing China at the United Nations. And Islamabad routinely defends Beijing on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on Tibet, and opposes what it calls the politicization of human rights by Western countries. In return, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, China has shielded Pakistan by blocking the listing of several Pakistani terrorists. However, Pakistan's own performance on the very indicators which the GDI claims to address is extremely concerning. Now, Pakistan ranks amongst the world's top countries for extreme poverty. It ranks at 109th out of 127 in the 2024 Global Hunger Index for food security. It ranks at 68th in the Huawei Global Digitalization Index, and that talks about its digital economy's readiness. It ranks at 99th out of 139 in the Global Innovation Index, which tells us about its innovation driven growth. Despite the CPEC being launched years before the GDI, measurable improvements in these areas have been limited. Political instability, security threats, debt servicing burdens, and project delays have repeatedly undermined expectations that CPEC would be a game changer for Pakistan's economy. So, the gap between rhetoric and results form the backbone for this discussion today. Coming to the second part, which is basically about CPEC's phase one and the pivot to industrialization via special economic zones. The CPEC is structured in phases. And if we look at phase one, it's roughly from 2015 to 2020. And that phase focused on foundational infrastructure, energy to fix chronic power shortages, outlaying of ports, especially Gwadar port, and transport corridors linking Kashgar in Xinjiang to Gwadar on the Arabian Sea via the Karakoram Highway. The second phase, or phase two, shifts emphasis to industrialization, agriculture, socioeconomic development, and technology, with SEZs at the heart of this vision. Now, under the CPEC, 44 SEZs have been proposed as of early 2026, which is an increase from an initial number of 9 priority zones. These zones offer generous incentives, duty free import of capital goods, and a 10-year income tax exemption. Um, I'll quickly examine 4 priority SEZs because it's not possible to, go into all of the 44. And the stories around these reveal recurring patterns of slow progress, structural bottlenecks, and unfulfilled potential. The first one is the Rashakai SEZ, which is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Development agreements were signed with Chinese firms as early as 2019, and the groundbreaking for these happened in 2021. The major issues which stand as of 2026 include high electricity costs, which is roughly about 22% of interest rates, 35% inflation, poor connectivity, unreliable power, and governance challenges. If we go back 2 years to 2024, Pakistan's own ministers were still intervening to offer discounted land prices to Chinese steel mills, highlighting ongoing difficulties in attracting and retaining investment. That's the first SEZ, Rashakai SEZ. Coming to the second one, the Alama Iqbal Industrial City in Punjab, Pakistan's Punjab. It's a 3,217 acre zone near Faisalabad. It was inaugurated in 2020. Some units have started production, but challenges have included environmental degradation, rising respiratory and waterborne diseases, hazardous waste, traffic congestion, and limited long term benefits for displaced farming communities whose compensation was often spent rather than invested productively. Coming to the Dhabeji SEZ, which is in Sindh, it was supposed to be focused on pharmaceuticals, on textiles and electronics. It's near Port Qasim. Um, but as of early 2026, construction was only 10.4% complete, despite agreements dating back years. Land encroachment, regulatory delays, infrastructure gaps, all of these persist. The fourth SEZ, or the Bostan SEZ in Balochistan, It was aimed at creating about 100,000 jobs through agriculture and food processing, but it's been severely hampered by security threats, attacks on Chinese workers, and infrastructure in Balochistan. Deadly incidents have happened even in 2024, and some of the many problems include utility shortages like gas, water, electricity, severe skilled labor shortages. Only about 6% of the workforce is skilled or semi-skilled. There is community resistance, and there is bureaucratic inertia. Across these four zones, there are some common themes which emerge, and those are of bureaucratic hurdles, security risks, especially in Balochistan, high costs of doing business, dependence on imported raw materials, and environmental or social costs, which get then borne by local communities. While the number of proposed SEZs has grown dramatically, the actual economic returns, which would be things like jobs or exports or technology transfer, they remain modest at best. And this has raised legitimate questions about long term viability. Coming to the energy projects, the railways and the Gwadar port, these show mixed results, and with these mixed results also come mounting costs. Beyond SEZs, CPEC also includes major energy and transport components. When we talk about energy projects, coal-fired plants like Port Qasim, which aims at a capacity of 1,320 megawatts, the China Hub, which also aims at 1,320 megawatts, the Engro Thar, 660 megawatts. These projects cannot be not mentioned. There are also some renewable projects like Quaid-e-Azam Solar Park. While these have helped reduce power outages initially, but as of 2026, they have been incurring extremely high costs, circular debt and arrears, efficiency losses, and environmental damage. Coming to railways very quickly, in the context of railways, the critical mainline one, or what's called the ML1, cannot be missed. The upgrade of this ML1 as of 2026 is estimated at 6.7 billion US dollars. This has faced repeated delays due to financing and other constraints. It has pushed Pakistan to seek alternative funding from the Asian Development Bank. Gwadar Port, which is positioned as a strategic energy hub and gateway, uh, its utilization remains far below potential, mainly because of security concerns, but also infrastructural gaps and limited cargo throughput cannot also be ignored. Overall, while some infrastructure has been built, the projects have contributed to debt pressures, and socioeconomic dividends for Pakistan have been slower and smaller than promised. Now, coming to what does this mean for China? What does this mean for Pakistan? And what is the strategic calculus over here? Um, China's deepening economic footprint in Pakistan, it serves as a real leverage for diplomatic and strategic gains, even when development outcomes are extremely underwhelming. Pakistan's consistent alignment with China in multilateral settings on core interests like counter-terrorism, blocking international scrutiny, it's not coincidental. Economic dependency strengthens this sort of an alignment. This dynamic offers a very cautionary lens on how grand infrastructure initiatives and development rhetoric can function as tools of influence, particularly when the partner country continues to lag on key human development matrices. It fits into the broader pattern which is observed in China's engagement across other countries in the region, and extends into the Indian Ocean region as well. Um, and there have been these frameworks of a silk noose or a silk cage, which showcase the dependency and the alignment of the recipient countries with China at multilateral settings. In short, or to just to summarize or to give the gist, CPECs, special economic zones, energy projects, infrastructure, they have delivered partial gains, but they've drastically fallen short of transforming Pakistan's economy or meaningfully advancing GDI priorities like poverty reduction or food security and innovation. The persistent bottlenecks, security, governance, debt, implementation delays, combined with Pakistan's strong diplomatic backing of China, suggests that there is a strategic leverage, which may be the more reliable outcome for Beijing than a rapid, inclusive development for Pakistan. This actually underscores several lessons. The first is that infrastructure partnerships must be evaluated not just by announced investment figures, but also on the ground by the sort of delivery which is taking place, by matrices around debt sustainability, and by assessing whether or not there are equitable benefits. The second lesson is that multilateral development initiatives like the GDI have to be scrutinized for how they interact with existing bilateral dependencies. The third lesson is that the countries in the region may benefit from diversifying partnerships by improving domestic governance and by improving ease of doing business and prioritizing security and human capital to ensure foreign investment translates into genuine progress. As we navigate an era of great power competition and competing connectivity visions, cases like the CPEC remind us that economic engagement is rarely value neutral. It often comes with strategic strings attached. And I know I've taken much less than the time allotted to me, but I wanted to, pick up some of these threads when we get into the Q&A and discuss more. So I'll just end here, and I look forward to the chair's comments and to the Q&A session. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This clicking of buttons is not always successful. I suppose that is not very different from the experience of the One Belt, One Road. Now, for the Q&A, Harita, you want to?
I'm sorry, I'm slightly mystified. Shriparna, you're done.
Ma'am, I can speak more, but I thought I'll take more questions and then speak more and add more, meat to whatever I said so far.
Oh, okay. You took 50% of the time. Oh, wow. Okay, so let's then get into a round of Q&A, and then maybe you can wrap up the entire discussion without reference actually to Q&A, but wrap it up in a sense to finalize it. Okay, right. Yes, Chair, over to you back.
Yeah, no, I was suggesting that maybe, Harita can now take over in case there are any questions on the chat mode.
There are no questions as of now in the chat box.
Okay, if there are no questions on the chat mode, then let's do it on a direct conversational mode. So let me invite the participants who are listening in. If they have any questions, please can you indicate your interest in asking a question? How do they do that? They switch on the camera first, or they make a request on the audio? How is it done?
So they can raise their hands
Okay,
and
there is
we'll
one here.
unmute them.
Okay, you have put in a message, right? Because if there are no questions, I am willing to ask one question to begin to set the ball rolling, as they say. Professor Pathak, you were speaking about the CPEC and the success and difficulties in attaining the stated objectives. And if I understood it right, at the end, you said about the strategic gains made by China and so on. The question I want to ask you is that if the Chinese had not offered CPEC, if they had not offered to finance infrastructure development in Pakistan, would Pakistan's support for China and strategic coordination with China have been any different? And if so, in what way might it have been different? But before you answer that, I find that there is a question on the chat mode, so perhaps you would want to give preference to that. Can you read that out, please, Harita?
Sure. There are two questions actually. I'll read the first one. It's by Venkatraman KK. He goes, one of the implications of CPEC was that this will facilitate China avoiding the Malacca dilemma. How far has China been successful in that?
Do you want me to take it one by one, or shall I? How should we do this?
But since at the moment there don't seem to be too many questions, we have what, one question by Venkatraman KK, there is another by Nazar Khan,
Nazar.
right?
Hmm.
Any
Yes.
positive difference may say any country. Okay. Both are relating to CPSC, so you
Okay.
could cover the two together if you wish. Yeah.
Sure. And I'll come back to your question again later, sir, because I find it very
Yeah,
interesting.
fine. I think my question should be dealt with if at all there is time, and with the
Sure.
very end, because we must give preference to the participants.
Right. Thank you, Venkat. Thank you for that question. I'll jump straight into the answer. See, the CPEC was indeed conceived as a cornerstone of China's BRI to mitigate the Malacca dilemma, because there is a strategic vulnerability of having over 80% of its energy imports pass through the very narrow straits of Malacca, which is under the surveillance by a lot of Western countries and its allies. But as of early 2026, China's success in using CPEC to completely bypass the Malacca Straits, it's marginal, and the structural challenges remain extremely high, with the initiative being described as, more this whole initiative is more like a long-term strategic option rather than a functional alternative. Despite 2 decades of efforts, including the CPEC, China's dependency on the Malacca Strait, it's not decreased. It's, forget significantly decreased, it's not decreased. And it actually remains about 80% or slightly more. Roughly 11 million barrels of oil flow through it daily, as per a lot of analysis from 2025 and so on. The Gwadar port has been underutilized. It was developed by China, it is officially opened, but it's largely underutilized. It has not evolved into the vibrant, high volume shipping hub which is necessary to handle significant rounds of Chinese oil imports. Then there are pipeline delays as well. The planned oil and gas pipelines from Gwadar directly to China's Xinjiang province, which would have been a true alternative, they've seen very limited progress, hindered by challenging Himalayan geography, by security concerns, and so on. The corridor passes through Pakistan's Balochistan region, where separatist insurgency against Chinese projects and workers, they've caused delays and heightened risks. It's also economically unviable because there are high transit costs for goods traveling through the Pakistani mountainous route compared to maritime transport. It makes it less profitable. Every winter, almost every winter, you will hear news or you will read news about the route getting closed down. I think last year winters also it was closed. And that leads to lower than anticipated commercial usage. So why does CPEC still matter to China despite all this low usage? Gwadar still provides China with a vital place in the Indian Ocean for naval monitoring, for future naval far seas protection missions, and so on. It could be seen as an alternative in a conflict scenario. It might be underutilized now, but one can never really completely, correctly predict the future. So it is, a plan is better than having no plan. In a worst case, where Malacca Straits is completely blockaded by a hostile power, CPEC will provide an overland pipeline to bring oil to Western China. If that will happen or not, that is, something that is yet to be seen. Also, CPEC solidifies China's this all-weather partnership with Pakistan. It provides, or at least it claims to provide, an independent route to the Arabian Sea, and so on. In short, CPEC has failed to replace the Malacca Strait as a commercial route, but it has partially succeeded in enhancing China's strategic options. It's more like an insurance policy. So, as of now, I would still say that in 2026, it's not produced great wonders. So, that's about it. I'll take the next question if I can go back to the screen 1 second. Right. Any positive difference made by CPEC? I'm assuming it's any positive difference made by BRI. I think that would be the question, right? Because CPEC is just China and Pakistan. So I'm assuming it's BRI. So see, BRI at the moment, hear too many discourses about it because it has faced backlashes from a lot of countries, especially in Southeast Asia, some in Central Asia, and so on. And in Europe, well, Italy has pulled out of the BRI. But one cannot write the BRI off because it is Xi Jinping's pet project. It is written into the constitution. So it has made some positive differences in very minuscule, some, very, very small number of countries. I'll just give you one example. There is transportation connectivity in Kenya and Laos. And I'm referring to the Mombasa Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya. Then there's the VNTN Botan Railway in Laos. That's improved transportation efficiency. There are negatives also of it, but yeah, the fact remains that something has been created. This BRI cannot be written off. Now it's being repackaged into green BRI or digital BRI and so on. The fact is that, the plans, at least on paper, they remain. Some of it has produced some positive benefits, which is now being utilized to showcase that, in another avatar like the green BRI or, the digital BRI, this will still bring in benefits. So that's where it is. But I would still say one needs to keep an eye on BRI and not write it off completely, because it's not disappearing anytime soon. I think there was
Yes.
another question from
There's one
Aqil
more
Ahmed.
question. Do you want me to read it out?
I'll just quickly, just give me like 30 seconds from an Indian perspective. Right. This is another very interesting and important question. See, while this BRI or the CPEC, whichever way that you see it, one has to also see the sort of projection which has been done by it, which is why a lot of countries readily joined in and joined hands. The effects might not have been as per what one might have assumed or hoped for, but yeah, there was a lot of projection and image creation around the BRI. That sort of image creation, perception, etc., hasn't been done by other countries with when they start their whole connectivity programs, be it Sagar, be it Mahasagar, be it Japan's Asia Africa growth corridor, be it Blue Dot, or so on. One really just hears about BRI, 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 and BRI. Now, coming from an Indian perspective, the difference between China's infrastructure model and India's approach to regional connectivity is, it contrasts a top-down and debt-driven model with a more inclusive, demand-driven, and transparent one. Now, if you look at, I'll just give you the example of Sri Lanka. The Hambantota port has been leased to China for 99 years. Well, now I think it's 95 years. I don't know which one of us is going to live for 95 more years, but for all purposes, it belongs to China. The nomenclature has changed, that it's leased out, but for all purposes, it is now belongs to the PRC, as opposed to say that those big ticket investments which China has announced in Sri Lanka, which have created debt dependencies. What India generally does would be, say, more sustainability driven programs. Say, when Sri Lanka was in debt distress, India reached out and said that we would also give as simple things as, say, fishing nets, because that is what something, a coastal country, or the most of the community would depend on for the sake of livelihood, or anti-malaria medicines, or schools for education, those sorts of things. These are not those big ticket dependency creating sort of projects. India's model has been more inclusive, more demand driven, and it has been more transparent one. It is easy to find out data and statistics about the sorts of loans or grants or aid which India gives, as opposed to China's BRI. Now, one thing which comes in also with the CPEC, which has to be mentioned, is that it also is violative of sovereignty because it passes through Pakistan occupied Kashmir. None of India's projects actually are violative of any other. That has to be mentioned. Um, since you mentioned Sagar, India promotes connectivity under Sagar and has been talking about Chabahar port, which only heavens knows what's going to happen to it given the situation in the Gulf countries. India has also proposed the India Middle East European Economic Corridor, all of which aim to provide viable alternatives law as well as sovereignty. in terms of financial sustainability or transparency as well, say if you look at CPEC projects, part of the BRI, they are marked by high interest, they are marked by opaque debt financing, uh, which leads to economic dependency. We've seen cases in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Maldives, and so on. The economic viability of a lot of these BRI projects have also been questioned. Um, as compared to that, India's projects, even under the Sagar or even the ones proposed under the IMEC, are presented as partnerships rather than unilateral top-down projects, offering local ownership and financial transparency, and employing the local workforce as opposed to getting workforce from the countries of origin. So this is such a sorry. The answers to this, come under so many rubrics. So I just tried to fit them into a few ones which are the most important ones and are worthy of being mentioned. But in case you want me to, pick up a few more strands, just let me know.
Professor, there's one more question. Should I read it out?
Yeah, no, I'm just going to quickly read through it. Sorry, I have a bad throat. Given SEZ. If we just okay, so Sukanya's question. Thank you for that question, Sukanya. Um, if we talk about the SEZs in Pakistan in particular, there is one problem that look, South Asian democracies are problematic. Democracies across the globe are problematic, but the ones in South Asia have one extra level of problems. Say, coming from an objective, rational vantage point of, say, the PRC, it is difficult to navigate all of these and understand why in Balochistan some things can be done and some things should not really be done. So that's one challenge. Would it, would it? Can we say that China's economic model or pattern is completely flawed? Well, look, it uses different sorts of models or different sort of when it goes and tries to sell these economic partnerships, it uses different lenses. So the sorts of development that it promises to a Pakistan would be different from the development that it would be promising to, say, a Papua New Guinea, or to say a Togo, or to say, a Sudan, and so on. So that calculation is done, but unfortunately well, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, it gets caught in a lot of crossfire, because as much as we wish that politics and economics don't get mixed, in real time on the ground, politics and economics often get missed. Is it a structural flaw in China's model of economic statecraft? Economic statecraft in itself is pretty huge. Credit where it's due, China at least thinks of what points can be leveraged in what different economies, which is why what would sell in, say, Vietnam would not really sell in, say, Afghanistan, would not really sell maybe in Pakistan, and so on. So, but yeah, it does end up facing a lot of pushbacks and economic hurdles and so on. Um, so, yeah, in a nutshell, that's that. I will come to Tanish's question on Afghanistan. Right. In 2023, Taliban had showed interest in joining BRI, and Pakistan agreed to extend CPEC. What would be the role of Afghanistan? Look, currently, international politics changes so quickly. Currently, Afghanistan and Pakistan are at loggerheads. So I don't think it's Afghanistan is going to join um, the CPEC in Pakistan. Um, I know China has showcased an interest in being a peace broker between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But given that, if you just track the number of conflicts which have happened between Pakistan and Afghanistan from 2025 onwards, still now, it's not going to be very easy that Afghanistan just joins in the CPEC. While the Taliban had indicated some sort of willingness, that was in 2023. Nothing has moved forward. We are in 2026, which means even before Pakistan and Afghanistan got into, these exchange of fists and blows, there were problems. Otherwise, it would have had been on a more immediate sort of, in a more immediate sort of way. So that being said, there are key roles of Afghanistan in the extended CPEC, which is also probably why China wants to broker peace between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Afghanistan could be seen as acting as a critical land bridge connecting China's Xinjiang province with Pakistan, with Central Asia, and Iran. But would China right now want to invest in this, in something which runs all the way to Iran, while the Gulf is in complete turmoil? I think China would also itself wait. So unless these geopolitical developments go back to what they were in 2023, I don't see it happening. I don't see the Taliban jumping into this into the CPEC. Okay, I'm going to quickly check if I've missed any question. In case any of you have additional questions, please feel free to type or answer.
There's one question from YouTube. What's India's response to CPEC and impact of CPEC on India?
What's the impact of okay, so India is one of the only three countries in the world which never joined the BRI from the very outset. The other two were US and Japan, and the reasons for all these three different countries not joining the CPEC are very different, but I'll just restrict myself to India, in addition to a whole lot of other problems like the lack of clarity on the sorts of goods that would be shipped from China to Kolkata port and then into Southeast Asia. While there was no clarity on that, another major problem was that, and still is that CPEC violates India's sovereignty. It passes through Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So this is the biggest problem, and India has refused to join it and will continue to join it because violation of sovereignty is not something that India is looking forward to normalize. Joining something that is violative of Indian territory, Indian sovereignty, will just mean a normalization of the fact that what is occupied by Pakistan is actually Pakistan. So that's not happening from India's side at all. So that's the impact of the CPEC. But of course, there are strategic calculations behind, because of which China invested in the CPEC, because of which this China Pakistan all weather friendship continues existing despite debt dependencies, despite Pakistan not being able to repay China in ways that maybe other countries could have and already have. Um, it is a problem, it is a threat because it's violating our territory. Of course, it's a sovereign concern. So that's roughly in a large effect. And heavens forbid, any sort of destabilization in India's neighborhood is something which is watched with concern. Even if it is, say, Chinese workers facing terrorist attacks in Balochistan, well, it is still India's neighborhood, and India has to keep an eye out. One, of course, watches what's happening in in their neighborhood. So yeah, that's the sort of impact. But given that CPEC hasn't really been able to create that sort of development for Pakistan or has reaped great economic benefits, it's something which is on the watch list, but it's not created massive disruptions. Okay. Right. How much Chinese investments have been recovered so far? Very difficult question because, as I said, BRI statistics are very opaque. And I think I saw at least one person here who has been doing a PhD thesis on the BRI. But getting the data is next to impossible because of the opacity. That's why during my presentation I was mentioning, or during the Q&A also, that as opposed to say India's projects or say for Japan's projects, there is no clarity on how much has been invested, what are the interest rates, what is the duration. So what has happened very often is that all of a sudden some projects which existed, China's investment projects, which say existed in Vietnam or say, Cambodia or Laos, even before the conceptualization of the BRI. Once the BRI came into being, those were also brought under the ambit or the aegis of the BRI. So shall this be considered as a BRI plan? But no, it was already existent, right? So those sort of definitional aspects are also there, and there's complete lack. It's shrouded in mystery completely. So how much of these have been recovered is, I wish I knew, but I think only Xi Jinping can answer. Okay. Do you think China will take Gwadar port on 100? Well, if one wants to do like a behavioral sort of analysis, and I'm probably assuming that this question comes in because Hambantota port has been leased out for 99 years to the PRC. So naturally, can we think that China will take Gwadar port on 100? Well, um, China already is operating. It's heavily invested. While it is not producing any sorts of impacts, it in some future scenario could be useful to bypass the Straits of Malacca. But the problem also is, as opposed to Hambantota, Gwadar faces much more significant hurdles. So, taking it would also mean a lot more costs and a bigger hole being burnt in China's pocket because of the security threats. Local insurgency, chronic water shortage, electricity shortage, connectivity, and so on. But if things change, and geopolitics is changing every single day when we wake up and read the news, there is another conflict. It's impossible to predict, but I would still say that China would think for some time before taking it over, because Gwadar is not Hambantota. There's a huge difference. Hambantota didn't have those sorts of challenges which Gwadar has. But yeah, if push comes to shove, China, which has already invested so much in it, maybe it would think it is lucrative. I'm sorry, I don't have a definitive answer, but yeah, predictions can always come wrong given the rates at which conflicts are breaking out every single day and geopolitics is changing. Okay, have I missed anything else? Harita, is there anything else in that I think I might have missed?
No, all questions have been answered.
Okay. So, Ambassador, sir, can I please try to answer the first question, because I still find your question very important.
If there are no other questions coming from the participants, yes, please, we can have a little dialogue. Yes.
So, sir's question, just to repeat for the ones who joined in a bit late, if
Can
the
I-
Chinese did not offer CPEC to Pakistan, would Pakistan...
Hello, I had put up my hand. Please.
Sorry, ma'am, I didn't see it.
No,
I am shuttling between the
okay.
screens.
And I agree that Ambassador Rangachari's question deserves, a special kind of a little special space. So let me just come in with my just a question, which is, it's not even a question. It's like musing aloud on the situation that exists at the moment in South Asia. Now, what occurs to me that, of course, we have all the issues, very pertinent ones, which you have raised. I'm looking at this entire OBOR, BRI, from the vantage point of how it is transforming the ground reality in South Asia. If we look at all the projects cumulatively, we have something akin to a transportation revolution, an infrastructure revolution, and we have in all these countries of South Asia large sections of the population who are in that good demographic space, which means that they are in the most productive cohort in almost all these countries, is between 18 and 35. And these are all people who are looking to bring about that kind of transformation in their standards of living, in their opportunities for further growth and development. So now my question is that this is a huge, huge impulse that is currently shaping ground realities in South Asia. And if we constantly just look at the entire scenario from a geopolitical perspective, or from the obviously the bilateral, competitive, even very conflictual dynamics, we are missing the wood for the trees. And while I am not denying any of those aspects that you have brought in, my question is, what extent do you think India and China can actually partner because India has the kind, you already laid out the strengths that it has. And more than China, I think the connections between the peoples in South Asia are much more enduring, much more historical. And therefore, are we missing an opportunity here to actually contribute to this groundswell, to this surging aspirations, and to actually making a difference to the way in which South Asia can emerge as a regional space? Face it, the India-Pakistan dynamic has completely messed up any opportunities for regional cooperation and economic integration. So I'm just saying that what are the possibilities, if any, and or is it just a hopeless scenario? We are locked in this competitive kind of spiral. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you for that question, ma'am. Also, it gave me some time to think of some parts of the questions that I had missed answering previously. Ma'am, before I come into what could be the future, because I think someone else had also asked about some other South Asian countries, and I missed answering this part. I'm just going to quickly talk about a few BRI projects in South Asia which have been cancelled or stalled by host countries. In Nepal, there was the West Seti and Seti River 6 hydropower power projects, which was originally awarded to China's Sino Hydro. Nepal cancelled the agreements in 2018 and then again in 2023. Same for Buddhi Gandaki hydropower project, awarded to China Kerchaupa project. Nepal cancelled the deal. Similarly for Tamor storage hydropower. Similarly for Kathmandu Pokhara Lumbini railway. In Bangladesh, Dhaka Chittagong high speed railway got shelved because the costs were too high. Sonadia deep sea seaport, again, Bangladesh cancelled it because of environmental degradation. Tista River Comprehensive Management Project, Bangladesh froze the proposal in 2023 due to financial concerns. The Pyra power plant expansion, cancelled due to debt and financing limits. In Sri Lanka, Colombo East Terminal, then there was the Sampur power plant, Kandy Colombo highway, water projects in Jaffna and Manar, and so on. Now, some of these projects have been handed over subsequently to India. The West Seti plus the Seti River 6 hydropower has been given to India. Arun 3 hydropower project also handed over to India. Tista River Management Project is something which Bangladesh has invited India to prepare a counter proposal as opposed to China's, and so on. Well, in Sri Lanka, there are many, many more examples. So I think the host countries of BRI projects in India's neighborhood are not happy with, well, China's financing or multiple hosts, other sorts of issues. So coming to ma'am's question, if say the host countries would agree to getting China back on board, maybe then a possibility could emerge. But given that they themselves have cancelled China's projects because of a host of different reasons, I don't know if any sort of collaboration can happen, because ultimately it's the host country which matters the most. So if it's a Nepal, if Nepal says yes to a collaboration, then maybe it could be thought of. But given that a Nepal, for example, has itself cancelled so many Chinese projects, or a Sri Lanka or a Bangladesh, I don't know if India would want to get entangled in the BRI and in the feelings that it's had in the neighborhood.
All right, go ahead. Thank you.
Has someone raised their hand or
Yes.
asked a question? I don't know.
There's one more question in the chat box.
Okay,
It's
from
from
Sheetal.
Sheetal. Yes. Much of the discussion on China-Pakistan economic corridor focuses on infrastructure and geopolitics. Could you please reflect on how local communities are actually experiencing these projects on the ground, especially those who are the real beneficiaries, and to what extent has CPEC generated meaningful employment for local populations, particularly youth and marginalized groups?
Hmm. Okay, interesting question. I'll go back to those SEZs which I had mentioned, and well, some of these have been criticized for environmental degradation by Pakistanis themselves. The Allama Iqbal Industrial City, for example, it's been criticized for environmental degradation as well as community displacement. Dhabeji SEZ, it has shown slightly more construction, but then again, embroiled in a lot of environmental degradation problems and so on. And it's the local communities themselves who have been complaining of these hazards which come about. Talking about employment, unfortunately, China has taken a lot of its own laborers to whichever country it goes to, including to Pakistan. While a lot of these SEZs or the projects around the CPEC, where there was a hope that there would be boosting of some sort of local employment, but local employment has also not been created, which increases the angst against Chinese laborers, which adds to the secessionist tendencies and the problems, say in Balochistan for that matter, which then leads to all sorts of devastation for Chinese laborers create that sort of you know employment or returns for the people in general, which is why it's getting more and more problematic, which is why even the Pakistani commoners, or say the civil society or the journalists themselves, have been questioning as to where is the CPEC headed. CPEC was, initially it was CPEC 1.0, but now it's CPEC 2.0. What major difference has it really made? Pakistan has only sunk further and further into debt and so on. So, over if we just look at even from the impact it has created at the community level, there's environmental degradation, which is not liked by the locals, of course. There is, there's also the turbidity of the water or the groundwater also increases, which is also not liked. There is no rise in employment, there is no skill development, and so on. There is definitely no tech transfer. So that's where it is, and which is why there are so many problems around the CPEC. Okay, I'm going to quickly check the chat box again. Okay. Harita, is there more which I might have missed or I'm not being able to see?
No, Professor. No more questions.
Okay, quickly, I still want to answer Sir's question, and I'll just do it in two lines. Pakistani support for China, if there was no CPEC, would be different, but it would definitely be there. After 1962, and a very enthusiastic Pakistan parceled off Sakshgam Valley and gave it off to the PRC. So there was that enthusiasm. Um, the all-weather friendship predates CPEC by decades, and their ties begin in 1951. Pakistan was also among the first countries to recognize the PRC, and it would still be driven by shared strategic interest. Unfortunately, both view India as a rival in as things currently stand, and so on. So the CPEC has had a role in amplifying this sort of all weather friendship and higher than the mountains and the deeper than the sea sorts of things that they have. But even if it was not there, maybe there would be support in some other format, and there would be the willingness from Pakistan for sure. So I hope I've answered your question. I wanted to just touch upon it.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for taking so many questions and answering them. If is there one more question? No. Okay. If there are no, there is a question again. Do you see Pasni Port?
Hmm.
Do you see Pasni Port, which is offered by Pakistan to USA as counter to CPEC, or Gwada Port and counterbalance to issues faced in CPEC? Ma'am, you are on mute.
Okay, sorry. Can you this Pasni port? So Pasni the port, there is a port in Balochistan, but it's not a major commercial or strategic port like the Gwadar. And I'm not very sure of there being some official records of Pakistan offering Pasni to the US as an alternative to Chinese involvement at the Gwadar or at CPEC. But what's true about Pasni Port is that it is a coastal town in Balochistan. It has a fishing port and so on. There are. I think I had read something like this. There was some sort of a media discussion on this and some sort of speculative analysis which suggested that Pakistan could offer the US access to coastal areas in Balochistan in order to balance China, or that US can and should look for locations near the Indian Ocean because it has no presence in Gwadar and so on. But well, if it happens, then yeah, I think there is definitely going to be a lot of interest, a concern also from China, and so on. But and I'm guessing that the US would also want to balance China, but I think it's a bit too busy, caught up in a whole lot of other things right now, and it's I don't think any very heavy counterweight to Gwadar from the US's side exists at the moment.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So, as I said, thank you very much for taking those questions. And since it looks like we still have a few minutes, I want to ask Alkaji and I want to ask you if I might try and put this in a global perspective.
Sure, go ahead. I mean, you're the chair. You can make as any summing as you think appropriate.
You are the boss, so you have to guide every one of us.
No. Please go ahead.
Okay, like, look, let's go to the basics. Back 20 years ago, or rather 13 years ago, when this whole thing started, the Chinese were running into an issue of huge excess capacities amongst their industries. And over a period of time, the Chinese have only continued to have an accretion to their foreign exchange reserves, which presently is around $3.4 trillion. Now, what do you do with this money? You can't spend it domestically because it has various adverse implications. You keep it parked in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. It has its own risks. And at the same time, your excess capacity does not go away. So in that sense, matching excess foreign exchange reserves and excess domestic industrial capacity is a good way to go about meeting the requirements of one and the other. Now let's look at the figures. Cumulatively, the commitment for this One Belt, One Road, and I'm deliberately not using BRI, for One Belt, One Road is $1.4 trillion. What is the ODA from the developed countries? It's around 200 billion a year over the last 30 years. What is the investment flow, FDI flow? It's about 1.6 trillion annually. So when you look at the magnitude of this funding, if these funds have to produce a return, the basic requirement is there should be due diligence in terms of profitability of the enterprises, the ability of the enterprise arising out of the investment made to generate sufficient profits to repay that investment and whatever debt may have been incurred. It should lead to greater economic opportunities domestically and trade externally. It should lead to greater employment domestically. And generally speaking, it should contribute to prosperity. That is the objective of ODA also, and 75% of all ODA comes from the G7 countries. Now, that is the kind of a revenue side of the thing. So you know the magnitude of the fund flow globally. Now, if you look at the due diligence part of it, that is probably the weakest in the OBOR configuration. Because investments made without due diligence in regard to their profitability will inevitably lead to debts which cannot be serviced. There was a question asked about how much of returns the Chinese have got. Currently, the Chinese Exim Bank is managing $400 billion of OBOR debt. So that gives you an idea of 1.4 trillion invested, $400 billion debt being managed by Exim Bank. What is the kind of magnitude of the issue that the Chinese are dealing with? Hambantota was mentioned, Gwadar was mentioned, Pasni was mentioned. Now, what is striking about Hambantota is that the Chinese didn't seem to remind themselves of the second Peking Convention of 1898, under which they conceded Hong Kong for 99 years. And at that time, what did they say? And subsequently, what have they said? Century of humiliation, imperialism, and so on. So, from a different perspective, when you look at the Chinese behavior in terms of managing their money which they have invested outside, and looking at it in the context of their own history, there is something to be spoken about. Railway projects, Kenya projects, that Nairobi-Mombasa project was mentioned. That railway line investment, which is not producing adequate returns, the collateral was the Mombasa port. So technically, if the Chinese got down to it and did a Hambantota or Kenya, they could take over Mombasa port. Now, taking over ports by itself or controlling ports itself is not an issue, because Chinese are presently involved in or associated with 129 ports around the world. The biggest Mediterranean port, Piraeus in Greece, is run by a Chinese company. In contrast to Hambantota, where perhaps one ship comes in a month, Piraeus is a very, very busy, the busiest of the Mediterranean ports. If you look at the ports rankings around the world, amongst the top 10, 7 Chinese ports are ranked. So therefore, as far as maritime connectivity is concerned or maritime related production capacities are concerned, Chinese are sitting very pretty. We talked about Malacca states. Very important, 80% of the oil flow to China is through the Malacca states. But we didn't talk about Hormuz. 40 to 45% of the oil that goes to China comes from Hormuz. And the plans of building pipeline surface links have not worked out as yet. So what is the Chinese position in regard to Hormuz, other than the principled position everybody takes that sea lane should be kept open? If the United States follows through on its threat of taking over Kharg Island and the other nearby island groups, and if it in any way takes control of Hormuz, what is the guarantee that instead of Iran, it will be the Chinese who will be guarantors of Chinese oil supplies Gulf oil supplies to China. So these are the kind of questions that we must look at and see. Now let's make a comparison with India. India's official development assistance in the last 25 years has been about $48 billion, not very big. Considering the size of our economies, not bad, but not great. What India has done is that it has ceased to be the net recipient of global ODA and instead has become the net donor in global ODA terms. And what India did in the case of Sri Lanka was mentioned, so let me make a reference there. When Sri Lanka got into trouble in 2025, India converted a $100 million loan into a grant. The Chinese rescheduled their debt, but did not convert anything into a grant. We also rescheduled. Apart from doing that grant, we also rescheduled. Now, there is an example. G7 countries, if you go back to the Cologne summit of 1999, and the initiative here was taken by the then Chancellor of Exchequer of Britain, Gordon Brown, the G7 countries forgave the debt of 15 highly indebted poor countries, HIPC, forgave their debt and also promised that they would reconsider and reduce downwards the terms on which investments had been made in those countries. There is no comparable initiative from the Chinese side. High-speed railway in Laos, how sensible was that as a project? Did Laos need high speed? A country like India, which has the largest number of passengers going all over the country using the railway network, we don't yet have a high-speed railway. Did Laos really need it? Malaysia renegotiated its railway project. So clearly, there is lack of due diligence, and here both parties are to blame, because I assume that the assumption on the part of the recipient country was that this was easy money and that they could get away by not repaying that money, which they had successfully done with the Western developed countries. What they did not perhaps bargain for was that they would have to be very substantial collaterals, Hambantota, Mombasa port, and so on, which the Chinese may well insist on taking over. So,
This is the
mix of it is all that there is a certain positivity in terms of increased flows of capital, and the negative side, insufficient due diligence, and here both the recipient and the donor are to be blamed, has resulted in the kind of problems that today has brought a bad name to OBOR. The Chinese have to do their thinking, what they wish to do for the future, and then present the world with whatever the new terms are and how they wish to approach this whole process. I think Professor Pathak is right. OBOR is here to stay. It's not going to go away. Within the Chinese system, having that large foreign exchange reserves and even today having excess industrial capacity, ways have to be found, and this is one way. What can be done is to find better terms, better ways in which the projects can be effective, profit-making, debt repaying, and lead to prosperity in the recipient countries. My apologies, Alkaji, for having taken so much time, but I thought that since there were about 24 participants or maybe 20 participants who are interested in the subject, they may find something of what I said useful. Thank you very much. So should we bring this to a conclusion now if there are no further questions?
Absolutely, no doubt. I think the global perspective that you've provided really puts things a bit more into context. So thank you very much for that. And yes, since this is the time that we have to wind up, Shriparna, if you have any final kind of comments, otherwise we will request our
No, ma'am. Thank you so much once again for having me, and thank you, Ambassador Rangachari. Harita, special thanks to you for putting out the questions and weaving everything so brilliantly. Thank you once again.
So I think
Thank you all.
Chair, we have your permission to wind up.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Speaker. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, we thank Professor Shriparna Pathak and Ambassador D.C. Rangachari for gracing today's session and sharing their time and insights with us. We also thank the audience for joining us. The video recording of today's seminar shall be available on the ICSS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled Money Circulations and Textile Exports from China through Indian Diasporic Connections, scheduled for 8th April 2026 at 3 p.m. IST. The session will be delivered by Professor Kak Hinchuk and chaired by Professor Madhavi Thambi. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletters for regular updates. Thank you once again and have a pleasant day.